Alright, hello everyone and welcome. I'm Makani Williams and this is my crash course on colonization of Korea and the role Japan played in the age of imperialism. Alright, let's get into it. From 1640 up until 1853, Japan was completely isolated from the rest of the world. That meant they would shoot any ships that sailed along their coast, kick out any foreign Europeans, or basically all that. That was until an American explorer by the name of Commodore Perry forcefully opened Japanese trade from its isolation. Perry was sent from the United States on President Millard Fillmore's instruction. He was a Navy man directed to open Japan to American trade. Perry was gifted access to the use of steam-powered gunships, just in case the Japanese weren't as subservient as they were in the past. This threat alone was enough to convince the rulers of Japan to sign some unfair trade treaties, opening them to trade. Now, despite the Japanese and Americans never actually going to war, this was a wake-up call. It resulted in the Japanese being convinced that if they wanted to maintain their independence, they would have to do some serious changes to their country as a modern nation state. So they needed to catch up, and fast. Japan began its rapid industrialization under the Meiji Restoration, a name based on the newly celebrated Emperor of Japan, Meiji. At this point, the Japanese were now interacting with many European powers. They gained information on the growing empires, the competition for land, as well as the beliefs regarding imperialism, such as social Darwinism, racial superiority, and nationalism. Japan had a culture built on honor and pride, so that's how they were willing to join in. With the Meiji Restoration underway, Japan set up one of the most modern nation-states in the world. They formed a European-style cabinet system, a government with a prime minister and all that stuff. Japan's government developed into something of a meritocracy. They were driven by the competition with the West, setting up working tax systems, building railroads, expanding harbors, erecting telegraph lines. They implemented necessary schooling to educate their population, and even created a national currency. The Meiji government set up a system in 1873 where all Japanese men were required to serve at least 3 years in the military. Initially, this wasn't taken very kindly, but after a few revolts, the act of serving created a patriotic spirit and strengthened the Japanese military as a result. In the following years, Japan's want to expand grew. In 1869, it increased its borders, including the island of Hokkaido, granting them their first taste of imperialism. Korea at this time was currently a tributary state of Qin Dynasty China, and completely isolated from the world, much like Japan was 20 years before. In 1864, Gojong, at the age of 12, was made ruler of Joseon, Korea. Being a little young for a ruler, he was replaced by his father, the Daewongun. While he ruled, the Japanese did attempt a contact for trade, but he resisted. Daewongun would also marry a woman by the name of Min. Queen Min's pretty cool, and her goal was to undermine her husband's rule. While they were married, Queen Min formed factions against the Daewongun. In 1873, Gojong, now the age of 22, was urged to by Queen Min to retire his father in place of himself, though due to her influence it was more like retiring his father in place of Queen Min. With the Daewongun gone, along with his policies regarding seclusion, Japan looked for new ways to fuel modernization with their growing population and need for more resources. They attempted to contact Korea again. Korea said no, so with a bit of encouragement via warships, the Japanese got Joseon to sign the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876. This was pretty similar to what America had did to the Japanese years prior. This treaty not only allowed Japan to trade with Korea, but also broke Korea off from a tributary state of China, and granted the Japanese some very nice and generous trading rights. Trade between China, Korea, and Japan was flowing. Queen Min received, quote, a strategy for Korea by a Chinese diplomat, which warned her of threats from Western powers like Russia, who had its sights set on her country. and how she should emulate Japan's modernization and success, and obviously ally with China. So Korea began their attempt at modernization, seeking to have the same success as Japan. At this point, Meiji's cabinet in Japan were aware that they were still slightly too weak to completely annex Korea, but they saw a growing independent Korea as beneficial since it would allow a hiatus for foreign influence. In 1882, Queen Min was forced to flee her palace due to revolts of mad peasants for poor working conditions and high taxes due to the recent industrialization. With this opening, Daewon-gun effectively reinstated himself as ruler. 4,500 Qin soldiers arrived in Korea and captured the Daewon-gun, stopping this rebellion and reasserting China's control over Korea. Over the next few years, Korea's government changed to favor a more traditionalist way of thinking. In 1884, the Japanese began supporting the Gaspin coup, opposing China's traditionalist control over Korea. There was a conflict that occurred suppressing this coup, as a result killing 40 Japanese. The Japanese later sent a warship expecting reparation for this event, eventually leading to the agreement between China and Japan to withdraw all military forces from Korea in 1885. This meant no Chinese or Japanese forces were allowed in Korea. 10 years later, a Japanese revolutionary, Kim Ok-gyun, was lured to Korea and assassinated. This made Japan pretty angry, and along with the rebellion in Joseon, Korea called for Qin intervention. So China sent troops. Beijing, Japan saw this as a violation of their former agreement and sent Japanese troops to Korea, despite Korea telling them not to. The Japanese stormed the capital, taking the government hostage. They requested China to remove their troops immediately. The Qin denied these commands since they had come from a captured Korean government. This gave Japan the perfect excuse to begin the First Sino-Japanese War. The beginning of the First Sino-Japanese War, a conflict between China and Japan, a fight for control over Korea. Okay, the Sino-Japanese War. What happened? The first one, yes, there are multiple, didn't officially start till after 2 battles had already taken place. The first battle was Japan's sinking of Qin supply ships that killed over 1,100 of their soldiers. Then Japanese militia made an attack on the Beiyang army. The Qin dynasty sent more soldiers in an attempt to cease the Japanese rampage. To no avail. Japan easily demolished the units sent. It wasn't much of a challenge for them since they had adopted a German style of conscript army. China, still suffering from the Opium Wars, couldn't compete due to their half-baked modernization, and this would continue to hold them back in the upcoming war. Winning these 2 battles granted Japan control over fundamentally all of South Korea and caused the Qin army to flee to Pyongyang. It wasn't until August 1st of 1894 when finally formal declarations of war were created. The efficient and coordinated Japanese army would arrive outmaneuvering and outnumbering the Qin forces in Pyongyang. While this battle was happening, the Qin dynasty's attempt to send reinforcements were intercepted by Japanese naval fleets, forcing the Qin to flee yet again due to massive loss in numbers. The next battle showcased the Chinese vulnerability in their modern fleets. They were seen as uncoordinated and the corruption still plagued the Qin dynasty. They had seen many weapons sold off or defective. After these battles, China abandoned the entire Korean peninsula, fearing for Japan's superior military efforts. With the taste of blood ripe in their mouths, Japan advanced their assault on China, pushing through with naval and land units. But the only problem was that Japanese troops weren't equipped for an all-out war. Their land advance lacked winter clothing and a reliable supply line. With winter on its way, Japanese official strategy was to just go as fast as possible. In their advance, they had found that many Qin troops had abandoned their posts. As they continued their push forward, they found this reoccurring pattern of getting to an outpost and there being no Qing troops there. With the winter of 1894 setting in, the Japanese arrived in Lushinko, Port Arthur, to find yet again that the Qin army retreated, completely deserted. Though there was one thing that they did leave, and that was mangled and mutilated corpses of Japanese war prisoners. This made the Japanese army real angry. So in turn, they carried out a massive massacre, targeting civilians and surrendered Qing soldiers. With the harsh blizzarding winter threatening to pause Japan's offense, the Japanese army officials concluded that the war would end in a loss or stalemate for them. They resorted to threatening China's capital in Beijing. In February of 1885, Japan led a naval and land attack on Wei Haiwang's fort. Stomping China's attempt to defend, capturing land batteries, resulted in the suicide of Admiral Ding and the destruction of the Beiyang fleet. After winter passed in April of 1895, the Japanese sent forces to Beijing. The Qin dynasty was finally like, okay, we give up, peace, please, peace. Thus, they signed the Treaty of Shimonoseki. This treaty was very generous to Japan since they were the clear winners. It then allowed them to take full control over Korea, Daogong Peninsula, Penghu Island, and even Taiwan. This single-year war won Japan a lot of land, suffering very minimal losses. After China's crushing defeat, many other European countries saw this as a window of opportunity, a chance to swoop in and snag some land for themselves. Germany, Russia, and France in particular said to Japan, "Hey, you can't take all that land yourself." And they confiscated some of the land that Japan had earned. These European countries began to carve out territories of China and sought to push Asian empires such as Japan out of the way. Japan would ally with Great Britain, seeking assistance. The current ruler of Russia, Nicholas II, wanted to create a railway all across their current territory and expand even further into the east, which also so happens to be overlapping with some of Japan's empire. They began to build a railway to Port Arthur and the surrounding territories in China. With the Boxer Rebellion, many European nations pitched in some military troops, and Russia did this as well. They positioned their troops along the building of the railway. After the rebellion had passed, for some reason, Russia increased their troops. Now, Japan didn't like this, a bunch of armed Russians on the land they wanted to expand upon. So they requested that Russia retract their soldiers from this territory. In return, Russia very politely told Japan to f*** off and also hand over Korea. Nicholas II was very confident that Russia would win if they had to resort to war, since they had 3 times the population, 5 times the military, and essentially infinite resources at their disposal. To be fair, they were pretty far away, but Russia was European, and Europeans don't lose. Japan declared war February 8th, 1904, just after they had laid siege to Port Arthur, disabling Russia's Pacific Fleet, silently spreading their armies into Korea, surrounding Port Arthur. While this was happening, Russia set up troops in trenches on the Yalu River, awaiting Japan's arrival. As Japanese forces began to pile in, fighting for honor, they forced the Russians back, retreating within the walls of Port Arthur. This is where Japan had simply outplayed Russia. 2 steps ahead, the Japanese already prepared an attack within Port Arthur and laid siege to the retreating Russian forces. Nicholas, needing to reinforce the Asian land, had sent fleets on land down the railway. Only having some inexperienced naval units in Europe, he sent them to the Pacific on a course down the Suez Canal. But this is where Russia acted straight up stupid. Before even leaving the Baltic Sea, Russian fleets fired on British ships thinking they were Japanese. Japanese ships in the Baltic Sea? That's just embarrassing. Because of this, the British denied Russians passage on the Suez Canal, in turn forcing the fleet to take a trip all the way around Africa, all through of West Asia and up the coast of East Asia. While on their trip, the fleets took many excursions, I guess you could say. They accidentally fired on their own ships a few times. On the coast of Africa, bought exotic animals which killed crew members. Basically, they were just wasting time and hurting themselves. Anyhow, while the naval fleet was lollygagging, the troops dispatched on the railway arrived to fight the reinforced Japan in early 1905. This is a famous battle for just purely its scale. The Battle of Mactan was the largest battle the world had seen before World War II. One reason the Japanese were able to compete despite them being so heavily outnumbered was their strong nationalism and cultural influence of Bushido, death before dishonor, no retreat, no surrender. Their keen tactics and defense abled them a victory on this front. In May, the exhausted Russian naval fleet finally arrived in Tsushima and were squashed by just a few Japanese battleships. At this time in Russia, there were many revolts against the war, and the remaining fleets in Europe mutinied, so Imperial Russian armies were forced to retreat. Concluding the Russo-Japanese War with the Treaty of Portsmouth, September 5th, 1905, mediated by President Roosevelt himself. Man, Japan had some really quick wars. I guess it's because they're so good at winning. This war shook the world. Up until now, European nations had not lost to a foreign one. This sealed Japan as the most prominent Asian power in the world. They were granted territories in China that they had before lost. This war proved Japan's greatness and, even more so, showcased Russia's stupidity, ending its chapter in imperialism, and eventually leading to the assassination of Nicholas II. Now, despite the perspective of an onlooker, the epic rise of the Japanese, the undefeated empire who started from the bottom, their epic escapade quite the introduction. But after the war, Japan raised money to fully annex Korea, and they had some pretty messed up aspects of their empire, as all do. In Japanese colonization of Korea, nearly all of the country's culture was wiped clean. The people of Korea were required by law to solely speak Japanese, and it was a crime to speak their mother tongue. They were not allowed to perform anything that would connect them back to their culture. And at first they were forced to keep their Korean names, but then as laws changed, they were given the option to change their name to Japanese. But this was more just for Japan to say they had a choice. In reality, people who lacked Japanese names were not recognized by the colonial bureaucracy and were shut out of everything from mail delivery to ration cards. It also became a crime to teach history from non-approved texts, ending in the Japanese burning over 200,000 Korean historical documents, essentially wiping out the historical memory of Korea. Many Japanese families moved to Korea. They chopped down trees by the millions and planted invasive, non-native species that transformed the landscapes into something completely different. Hundreds of thousands of Korean workers were forced to work in Japan and its other colonies. Korean resistance movements were met with bloody genocides of the protesters, resulting in deaths of the thousands of civilians. It was truly devastating to the culture and history of Korea. Sorry to get a little somber there. Why don't we change gears and take a look at some political cartoons to cheer us up? Alright, so this first political cartoon shows the world watching over as Russia and Japan fight over Korea. Russia is depicted as a bear, obviously, and Japan a dog. The two are biting onto this bone, labeled Korea, and tugging either side. This obviously represents the fight with Russia and Japan over Korea. The next political cartoon shows a Japanese and Russian battleship in water, and the Russian one is steaming from shots sinking into the water. And above it says, "Oh, what a surprise!" Because it was very surprising that the Japanese were winning against the Russians. The next image shows Nicholas II and a reaper figure looming over him, labeled Revolution. It has a knife in its mouth that's labeled Assassination, and it's coming out of a pot labeled the Russo-Japanese War. There seems to be some holes inside the reaper that spell out debt. Now, this obviously is depicting the reason for Nicholas II's assassination. The Russo-Japanese War causing so much debt, making a revolution start, leading to his inevitable assassination. Now, the next one's more of a comic, but I really enjoy it. So, there's Japan walking along with a gun, and it says, "Loaded for bear." And then there's Port Arthur with Russia being shot by the gun as a bear. The next frame shows Russia scurried up a tree, and Japan waiting at the bottom, saying, "I haven't begun yet," and Russia saying, "I wasn't prepared." All right, so I just wanted to include one of these. So leading up to the war, or in the beginning of the war, the Russo-Japanese War, there was so many political cartoons made of Russia just absolutely destroying Japan, and many of them were printed with "surely victorious." I just wanted to include one of these because it's just so funny in retrospect. All right, so the next one, it says the championship of the Far East, and we see a little man who has Japan printed on him and a massive bear with Russia printed on him. Russia, as the bear, has a bunch of patches from being hurt, and it's all concussed and stunned. Japan stands below him, asking, "Haven't you had enough yet?" This is quite funny to see how much Japan was destroying Russia. In the next political cartoon, we see Japan with this nice coat over him, and Russia with this massive, extravagant coat, a cross, and this great crown. And in between them, there is President Roosevelt of the United States. He's holding both of their shoulders and kind of gesturing to a drum with what looks to be a peace treaty. Now, this next one's pretty obvious to what it is. Again, it's the Russo-Japanese War, and there's a man in the center being pulled by two ends of the rope in a tug-of-war between Russia and Japan. This man is most likely Korea, because Korea was being fought over in the Russo-Japanese War. And the next one, so this one's one of my favorites. We have all of the European countries in the back watching, John Bull, the Frenchman, all of those. And we have a chess table with Japan versus Russia. Japan sits there, small in their chair, kind of has their hands clasped together, looking very confident, and Russia, their hands on their forehead, definitely a headache, just trying to think of what to do. See, this one's really funny because it just shows how poorly Nicholas II led the Russo-Japanese War, and how great Japan was in it. Alright, so this next one does not actually depict the Russo-Japanese War. I know, surprising. But it does depict the Boxers' Rebellion, where China has their hands up in the back. They're all, "Hey, why are you taking my land?" And all of the European countries, we see Britannica, and even Japan is there as well, thinking of what to take. And they all, Russian man, he sticks his knife in the center. They're all around taking pieces and slices of what looks to be a pizza labeled China. I really like this one as well. All right, and this next one, which I actually really like, I didn't remember this one, but we have a Japanese man in the back, and Japanese, what does that say? Torpedo boats. My bad. Torpedo boats chasing after this massive dog, dragging Nicholas II, and this massive dog is labeled Russian battleships. Now, this is obviously depicting the mutiny that occurred in Russia because they were too scared to fight against the Japanese. They didn't want to travel all the way around Africa and get destroyed as soon as they arrived. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what this is depicting. Again, love this one. It's so funny. Alright, this political cartoon. This one I actually really like. It shows Russia bottled up inside a bottle labeled Port Arthur with all these Japanese men walking up these ladders and around, and this obviously represents how Japan led Russia to retreat into Port Arthur, but they had already planned for this and surrounded Port Arthur, just ready to prepare to lay siege to their troops. And yeah, this one's really good. In this political cartoon, we see Japan walking over Korea, kind of disrespecting them. You see their shoe on Korea's face, and above it says, "So obliging." Korea is holding a paper that says, "I hereby grant you a permit to traverse Korean territory." And this obviously is depicting the Japanese-Korean Treaty of 1876. In this image, it seems that Japan is using Korea as a bridge to cross the Yalu River. It also depicts Japan and Korea wearing different clothing. Korea, on one hand, wearing more traditional Eastern Asian clothing, and Japan wearing very much European aesthetic, carrying a gun with a bayonet and all. Anyhow, that brings me to my conclusion of this crash course on Japan's imperialism and Korea's colonization. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Again, I'm Makani Williams, and that's it. Bye.